Reactions. They are one of the most important mechanics in Genshin Impact, and arguably what's more important is understanding them. With that being said, let's start with some important terminology you'll hear throughout the video. Heavy attack, also referred to as blunt attacks. These encompass all claymore attacks, all plunging attacks except for bow and catalyst, and most geo attacks. Basically anything that heavily damages ore or geo shields is considered a heavy or blunt attack. This term is mainly important for freeze, which we'll get into a little bit later. Transformative reaction. These reaction types cannot critical, and the damage they deal are only based off the level and elemental mastery of the character who triggers the reaction. The enemy's defense doesn't matter as these reactions ignore it, but the enemy's resistance to the element of the reaction does matter. Some artifact sets, passives, etc. can influence the damage, but as far as raw stats go, only level and elemental mastery matter. Many reactions are transformative reactions, and I'll let you know when they come up alongside a little definition refresher. Lastly, we have gauge units. This is a very advanced and complex mechanic within Genshin, so I want to summarize it as simply as possible. Gauge units are essentially an invisible number representing the amount of element currently on the enemy or yourself. Different characters and different skills will apply a different amount of these gauge units. Honestly, it's a topic worth a completely separate video, so it's just worth mentioning here and knowing that they exist. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start with the main elements: Pyro, Hydro, Electro, and Cryo, and how they can interact with each other. I'm gonna keep Dendro in a separate section because it's pretty complicated on its own. Starting with Pyro, we have Vaporize. This is what happens when you mix Hydro and Pyro. You get a 1.5 times or 2 times bonus depending on which element triggers the Vaporize. If the enemy is wet and you hit them with a Pyro attack, it'll be 1.5 times damage. If the enemy is imbued with Pyro and you hit them with a Hydro attack, it'll do 2 times damage. Next you have Melt, which is very similar. It's just Cryo plus Pyro. In this case, it's 1.5 times damage if Cryo triggers Melt, and 2 times if Pyro triggers it. Vaporize and Melt are both considered amplifying reactions, meaning they take all the normal damage calculations, your crit damage, your attack, etc., and just amplifies the damage when one of these reactions hit. This actually isn't the case with a lot of other reactions. Like our next one here, Overloaded, which is what happens when you mix Electro with Pyro. This will deal AoE Pyro damage. If the enemies are on the smaller side, it will knock them back. And Overloaded is considered a blunt or a heavy attack. So this reaction is good for geo shields. It can technically shatter a frozen enemy, etc., etc. It is also our first transformative reaction. Moving on to Hydro, we of course have Vaporize again, mixing with Pyro. Hydro plus Electro is Electro charged, and this will deal damage over time once per second. It can also chain to other wet enemies or yourself, and the time in which an enemy or yourself are Electro charged is dependent on this more advanced mechanic called gauge units, which we talked about a little earlier. Electro charged is another transformative reaction. Next, you have Hydro plus Cryo, which equals Frozen. This does exactly what it sounds like. It'll freeze the enemy. It deals no damage. The enemy will continue to be frozen until the weaker element's gauge units run out. Hitting a frozen unit with a heavy attack causes a different reaction called Shatter, which deals physical damage. Shatter is also considered a transformative reaction. Moving on to Electro, we've already gone over Overloaded and Electro charged, but the new one here we have is Electro plus Cryo, and that's Superconduct. Superconduct deals AoE cryo damage. The damage it does deal is small compared to other reactions, but more importantly, it does reduce the physical resistance by 40% for 12 seconds. This is also a transformative reaction, not that it really matters that much in Superconduct's case, since you're only going to be doing Superconduct for the physical resistance decrease and not to deal damage itself. And by the time we get to the Cryo element, we've obviously already gone over everything. Melt, Pyro plus Cryo, Frozen, Cryo plus Hydro, and Superconduct, Cryo plus Electro. Moving on to Anemo, mixing Anemo with any of the 4 main elements causes Swirl. It deals AoE elemental damage of whatever element mixes with it, and also applies the enemy hit with that same element. Hydro works a little differently in that only the wet status is AoE, whereas the damage only goes to the one directly hit. Because of the way Swirl works in spreading elements, you can do some interesting combinations. Like if one enemy is imbued with Hydro and another is imbued with Electro, triggering a Swirl on either of them while close enough together will cause electrocharged, etc., etc. Swirl is also considered a transformative element. Only level, elements mastery, and any artifact set bonuses will increase the damage. Swirl cannot crit. like all transformative reactions. Moving on to Geo, much like Anemo, mixing Geo with any of the 4 main elements causes crystallize. It itself deals no damage, but creates a pickup based on the element combined with Geo that grants you a shield that lasts for 15 seconds or until broken. The resulting shield has a base HP depending on the character's level who creates the shard. The shield will get bonus HP depending on the element of mastery of the character who creates the shard. In this way, it is sort of like a transformative reaction as well. These shields can stack with other shields provided from certain character talents, but they will take their normal amount of damage at the same time. So stacking shields is not actually all that useful. These shields will also provide resistance to interruption and will be 250% effective versus the same element as the shield. So yes, we are now moving on to Dendro. Again, I wanted to keep Dendro purely separate since it's basically an entirely different world. It has a total of 7 different reactions by itself, 2 branching reactions that can lead to 2 different reactions each, and then there's burning. Let's start with burning, which is a mix of pyro and Dendro. As you might guess, this deals pyro damage and will continue to do so until one of the element's gauge units are depleted. The burning state continually applies pyro gauge units while depleting Dendro gauge units. Burning is also considered a transformative reaction. Moving on to Quicken, which is Dendro plus Electro, Quicken itself does pretty much nothing except open the door to spread or aggravate, both working very similarly to each other. While the enemy has the Quicken status, hitting the enemy with a Dendro attack will cause spread, a flat base damage increase for that attack. The same thing will happen when you hit with Electro, causing aggravate. The only difference is the damage bonus for aggravate is, for some reason, smaller than spread. 1.15 versus 1.25. The damage bonus for both of these reactions is based on the triggerer's level first, then multiplied by elemental mastery. It will then be affected as usual by any other stats like crit damage, attack, the enemy's def and resistance, and so on. So it does work similarly to a transformative reaction in that it is boosted by level and elemental mastery, but all other stats will affect the final damage as well as the fact it can critical. Triggering spread or aggravate does not remove the Quicken status, but Quicken will be gone eventually unless reapplied. And finally, we have Bloom. Bloom is Dendro plus Hydro. Triggering it will spawn a Dendro core. Only 5 of these can exist at once. They will explode after 6 seconds or earlier if more than 5 try to exist. They deal AoE Dendro damage to both enemies and players alike, but players only take 5% of the original damage. Bloom is purely a transformative reaction. The only way they can crit is Nahida C2. Burgeon and Hyper Bloom are reactions based on what you hit the Dendro cores with. Dendro Core plus Pyro is Burgeon, which instantly explodes the Dendro Core, dealing extra AoE Dendro damage. Dendro Core plus Electro is Hyper Bloom, which transforms the Dendro Core in several small missiles, homing into the target, dealing extra Dendro damage but with much less AoE. Both Burgeon and Hyper Bloom are more powerful than Bloom by itself, going from x2 multiplier for Bloom to x3 multiplier for both Burgeon and Hyper Bloom. Burgeon and Hyper Bloom are both transformative reactions as well, but it should be noted the damage scales with the level and element mastery of the character that hits the Dendro Core with Pyro or Electro to create these new reactions. So there you have it. Those are all the current reactions in Genshin Impact. There are some specific things that were left out on purpose, just for brevity's sake, like the fact you can do Electro Charge on a body of water and enemies passing through it will take damage. Mainly stuff like that, but also the super complex formulas of these reactions. So this pretty much marks the end of the guide. I did want to put a fun little reaction tier list here at the end. So obviously this is going into opinion based. If you don't care, leave the video. It's all good. Just thought it'd be something kind of fun to do. I'd say over half of these reactions I don't use or even bother trying to use. So there's definitely going to be bias here, but yeah, I'd say both Vaporize and Melt deserve S tier since they are some of the only non-transformative reactions that take the rest of your stats into consideration, and I just rather like that. I would put Vaporize above Melt just because that's what I use the most. I feel like there are a lot more teams that can do, really good Vaporize because of the easy access to good off-field damage units like Xingqiu. Overloaded, I'd probably put near the bottom, honestly. Every time I've tried to use an overloaded team, it's just annoying with the enemies getting knocked around all over the place. Generally, the enemy is small enough or non-shielded aren't that much of a threat in the first place, so the knockback is just more annoying than it is helpful in my experience, especially when I use Yoimiya, because then like half of our arrows miss. Electrocharge I would probably put at low A, high B. It is a very nice reaction in AoE scenarios, but you know, a lot of the hardest stuff is a single enemy like a boss. So I'm gonna put it in A, but it's definitely a low A, high B for me. Next we have Frozen. So freeze teams were like my jam for a little while. The problem with freeze teams and Frozen is that all bosses cannot be frozen, and there are even non-boss units that can't be frozen, as well as some having freeze resistance. So again, it's not that good. I would probably put it around with like Overloaded. As for Superconduct, it's not a reaction I use that often, but for its intended purpose of reducing physical resistance, it does that really well. Physical has fallen a little bit by the wayside in the meantime, since we have all this Dendro stuff going on now, but for what it is, it's still a good reaction. I would definitely put it in A tier. As for Swirl, this is a pretty hard one for me because I never like specifically make a Swirl team. It's just something that kind of happens every now and then when I have an Anemo in my team. I never purposely do it. I think a lot of the really good Anemo units like Kazuha, for example, are mainly good because of their buffs and talents and such, and not because of swirls. Though most Anemos are built with a ton of Elements Mastery, and it is a transformative reaction which scales with EM, so swirls typically do a decent amount of damage. I really don't want to put it in S tier. I don't even really want to put it in A tier, but I'll put it in A tier. You can do some interesting things because it spreads the element as well. As for Crystallize, it's pretty meh. I never cared for Crystallize, never even picked up those shards on purpose, honestly. Well, maybe once or twice, but it's pretty rare. Again, this is probably biased since I used to run Zhongli a lot and you don't need those shields with him. Even so, I'd have to put it somewhere low. As for burning, I did try it out a little bit. I never noticed any massive damage and I always had a pretty hard time keeping the burning going. It just always left pretty quick. I'd imagine you'd have to continually supply the burning with Dendro, which makes logical sense, honestly, but yeah. I'm gonna throw burning in C. It's kind of weird. I'd say both spread and aggravate deserve to be in S tier. Actually, I think just to mix it up, I'm gonna put aggravate in A tier just because it has a lower multiplier for some reason. These are reactions that take all your stats into consideration, so I think they're good. And then we have Bloom. I think Bloom by itself, without the bountiful cores, is kind of just okay, honestly. By the time they finally naturally explode, the enemies could have moved away. I was using Bloom before Nilou, and it was still not bad, but definitely not anywhere near like Bountiful Core Bloom. Bountiful Core would get an easy S from me. Bloom itself, probably give a high B, low A. Let's go A. As for Burgeon and Hyper Bloom, I will admit I've never properly ran a Burgeon team anywhere serious. It has the same damage multiplier as Hyper Bloom, so I assume the damage is actually good. Hyper Bloom is, in my opinion, a little bit more interesting though, because of the sort of team structure already. For Hyper Bloom, you need Hydro, Dendro, and Electro. So you can also trigger Spread and Aggravate in this team, which will help those units. Pyro doesn't really have a place outside of Burning, which can kind of mess rotations up, actually. And I think that's why Burgeon isn't quite as popular as Hyper Bloom. So I'd put Hyper Bloom in S, honestly, maybe a low S. Burgeon I don't have a ton of experience with, but just on paper, I would say it's more of an A. But yeah, that'll do it. Tell me what you think. Feel free to agree or disagree with my tier list there at the end. Thanks, as always, for watching, and until next time.